Yes, hello, ladies and gentlemen. I have a great pleasure and a great privilege to have this talk with a person I love, admire, and I think that she is one of the brightest Russian analysts all over the world. Lilia Shevtsova, she describes herself as a Moscow resident and as a fellow with the Brookings Institute and Chatham House in London. But at the same time, Lilia Shevtsova is the name where I think wherever you mention the name of Lilia Shevtsova, you would find yourself at home in the world of political analysis, social analysis. And in addition, I would say that Lilia Shevtsova is extremely sensitive to what's happening in this part of the world, the Baltic region, Nordic countries. So that's why I think that it's a great privilege for us to have Lilia Shevtsova here at Vytautas Magnus University. And of course, Lilia, I cannot act otherwise than giving very warm applause.
Well, dear Leonidas, it's a great fun. It's pleasure. It's a great treat to be here and to be here with you. And of course, what you said, it's a huge exaggeration, but so pleasant, so you can continue.
Okay. I will try my very best. Lilia, I would say that we live in a turbulent time. And it's not exaggeration at this point. I think that it is a turbulent time. Well, we know that the Chinese used to say that if you have an enemy, wish him or her to live in an interesting time, the time of change. Ours is a time of uncertainty. I think that it's fair enough to say that this is the 21st century, where many things are bound to change, are bound to be, well, I would say, revised. And that's why my question would be, what happened? What would you say? People were inclined to describe the 20th century as something that started with the First World War and ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the 21st century, when did it start? Did it start with the collapse of the Soviet Union? Did it start with 2014? What happened to Crimea and Ukraine? What is the way you would describe the 21st century with all its uncertainties and turbulences?
Of course, Leonidas, I could repeat what you said together with Professor Bauman recently. I watched your absolutely smashing and marvelous dialogue. I could repeat something about interregnum, about liquid modernity, but I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not sure that I'm really a very sophisticated analyst. And maybe what I would say would be a mistake, because now I do believe that the 21st century hasn't started yet. Because what we thought is the beginning of the 21st century, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the bipolar international system and Cold War, it appears to be not true. It appears to be an illusion. Because now we only understand that we spent 25 years, 25, is it 25? After the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we spent quarter of the century living in a paradise of mythology, stereotypes, illusions, and half-truth, because we thought the Cold War is over. And now so many people are talking about the Third War and the Second Cold War. And so many people are talking about the re-energized Soviet Union. And finally, we with you and our colleagues, now we understand that we have now to re-evaluate our axioms during the 25 years. So we have to re-evaluate what the Cold War, what the collapse of the Soviet Union meant. And I'm coming to conclusion that you are much stronger with this. But I'm coming to a very simple conclusion that we are now in the midst of unfinished history and unfinished collapse of the Soviet Union. And we only observe and we are participants of the process that we could call implications of the 1991 with the need to reassess it. And to reassess the fact that the Russian system, the Russian matrix, the Russian system of personalized power is still alive. And it demonstrates amazing sustainability and durability. And it demonstrates an amazing capacity to reincarnate itself. And 1991 was not the collapse of the Soviet Union, but was the moment when the system simply took off the previous had washed the makeup and reincarnated itself in a new form just by dumping the Soviet Union as a state. Sorry for this long description of my uncertainty about what the new century is. But would you agree that the 21st century has not happened yet?
Well, I think that it's quite, I think, substantial what you have said, Lilia. And I believe that in a way, we fell prey to many illusions. I think that what happened to us, that we started believing after Francis Fukuyama, that
the end of history. Well, such a stupidity. Well, I love Frank, but such a stupidity.
Yeah, but in a way, so it was crap. I hate to say this, but it was just...
Frank, you don't hear us, okay?
Yeah. But in a way, well, I think that what happened to us was a very sweet lullaby that we started singing to ourselves. And this funeral music to the Soviet Union, accompanied by our very sweet illusions about the new world to come. And what happened to us, that in a way, we just felt that we were totally unprepared for the return of history. The history is back, isn't it?
Yes, but when you're talking about we, do you mean you Lithuanians, you citizens of Baltic states? Because you understand us. When you scratch your skin, you feel it. You feel what's happening with us. Or you're talking about the Western West, the old Europe, the old West. Apparently the old West is much more guilty of misconceptions, of false hopes, of the fact that they had a lot of illusions. I don't think that you, Leonidas, and your friends and colleagues had a lot of illusions, especially maybe after 1993, Yeltsin's new constitution, when Yeltsin shut down the parliament. I don't think that you had any illusions. And when you're talking about, I need to have your book, by the way. When you are talking about, what's the title of the book? Moral blindness. When you're talking about moral blindness, you're talking about repercussions of these 25 years that, in fact, were an illusion. Because the repercussion is of something that has been a fault, not true, false, faked. So this is what you're talking about. Or not? Maybe, well, because I haven't read your book.
In a way, yes. In a way, yes. I would say that moral blindness is, well, it's a phenomenon which is quite widespread in the world. And I think that the great paradox is that, Lila, look, we believed for a long time that, that the West could be a sort of suffering from self-inflicted blindness. But we are part of the West now. It happened for the first time in our history that the Baltic region has become part of the Western world. Yes. Lithuania, before the Second World War, was more or less integrated into the trade system. It was not integrated into the security system. But what happened to the Baltic states was that, well, the country fought very hard to be integrated in the West. And now it's very difficult to split the West by assuming that we are the right side and they are, on the false side. It's very difficult because we have to work very hard, assuming responsibility for, many things.
Including misconceptions and illusions.
Including misconceptions and illusions. Concerning Yeltsin, I remember I was just a kid, with, with nothing to lose and much to say to myself and to my friends. But Yeltsin was a hero in the Baltic region. After his visit to Estonia, that was unforgettable days when he, as president of Russia, appealed to the Russian military, saying that I, Russian president, ask of you not to disgrace the Russian military by shooting to civilians. Please never do this. And of course, that was very moving.
That was a great moment.
It was a great moment of history. And I believe that what happened to Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia is we turned one blind eye to the second Yeltsin, to Yeltsin after 1993, to Yeltsin with the Chechen-Russian war, with Yeltsin who started changing his rhetoric. When Yeltsin, who I started touching myself as to examine whether I am, whether this is happening for real. He was, during his visit, having a conversation with Bill Clinton, and all of a sudden I felt that Yeltsin is not the same person I used to know. So meaning that this trajectory of intimidation, blackmail, reminding that we are a nuclear power, that was the phrase offered in the White House, that we are the nuclear power. So that was something that we should have taken more seriously, but still Yeltsin was our hero. I think that we had our illusions. in the Baltic region as well. But of course, we were not naive concerning some things that were absolutely beyond West European horizon. But look, moral blindness is something which could be described in the following way. There was Russian-Georgian war, and all of a sudden people spoke of some lack of responsibility of Mikhail Saakashvili. They spoke of some sort of, turbulences. Nobody in the West spoken about the change of paradigm. And then we had the Russian-Ukrainian war, and again, that was a big inclination and a big temptation in the West, Western European countries, to talk about, lion's share in responsibility on the Ukrainian side. That is something that would allow me to say that we are not perfect either.
Just like in the movie, nobody's perfect.
Nobody's perfect. Nobody's perfect, I think.
Some like it hot, yes.
Some like it hot. Nobody's perfect.
But maybe we should switch to another topic, but still I'm stubborn to dwell on one thing. It seems to me that the West, I'm talking about political West, and I'm talking about analytical and intellectual West. The West has screwed, rather vulgar word, of course, twice. Because, you were too young, but I remember, I'm too old to remember. Before 1991, the Western political world and the Sovietology, for so many years had been persuading that the Soviet Union is tough and strong as the rock. I remember the best of the best, in the West, the best of the Western experts. In 1991, the year of the Soviet collapse, when everything started to unravel in the Soviet Union, when you already jumped the board, the Soviet expert in the West still thought that the Soviet Union is as strong as a rock. And they were humiliated by their own lack of ability to understand and to foresee. And I do believe that now, 2016, the Western politology, political science, the Western analytical world, European and American political world, intellectual world, again, they have humiliated themselves by not predicting, by not foreseeing, by not understanding that Russia already, after 2004, Orange Revolution in Ukraine, has started to change the paradigm from liberal dress-up, from faking and imitating liberal institutions, to much harsher authoritarianism and to containment of the West. And now the West, at least my colleagues in Berlin, in Paris, in Washington, in Brussels, of course, the most pathetic place, intellectually, I would say, they're shocked and paralyzed because they don't know what to do with that. The world order does not exist because Putin just flipped over, even kicked over the global chessboard. The treaties do not mean anything. It's even more than liquid modernity of Zygmunt Bauman. It's even more than interregnum, a pause. Of course, it's a pause, but what kind of pause? When the reckless, ambitious, desperate hooligan is just breaking China, throwing stones into windows, and forcing the West, the most powerful civilization, to accept their rules. Isn't it scary? For me, it's scary. I just can't understand. And it's already 2 years for the West to gain some reason, some courage. Well, still, I'm looking at the Western community as rather, not pathetic maybe, because, my colleagues, Western colleagues, have started to gain some at least angst maybe, or readiness to analyze. But so many myths on the table that should be discarded. Mm-hmm. Everything has to be thrown into the dustbin. It's just, we need a new revolution, intellectual revolution.
In a way, yes. I would say that, what happened to the West was something that started resembling some events before the Second World War, I have to say. Naivete, self-inflicted naivete. Yeah. But at the same time, I do remember the phrase offered by Alain Besançon. Alain Besançon, who believed that the strength of the Soviet Union was the inability of the West to understand it. The strength of communism lay in the inability of the West somehow to comprehend and analyze it. And I think that something like that could be said about Putin and Putin's Russia. So this is a failure in many ways to analyze, applying proper terms. And I think that the inability to understand Putinism is the root of its success, I think, in many ways. But I cannot help thinking about one more thing, about people who were not naive, especially Russian, Ukrainian, East European dissidents and political analysts. For instance, concerning the collapse of communism, I think that we were taken by surprise. Not we, of course, not the Balts. But I think that in the West, they were not prepared. But it was Andrei Amalrik who wrote, "Will the Soviet Union survive until 1984? It was the Lithuanian political scientist, he was an emigre scholar in Britain and the United States, Alexander Stromas, who predicted this happen. So that was a very tiny club of those who believed that communism wouldn't last long. But among Western colleagues, I think that there were very, very few, if there were, which I'm not certain of. And I believe that what's happening is probably, Lilia, maybe this is the time for me to ask a question. Probably this is a pattern. Look, what happened before the Second World War was something like, that when there is a fascist movement, there is the rise of totalitarianism or fascism. It prevails for some time. But when democracies consolidate their power, then they prevail. Is it something that may happen again? Don't you think that, there is a challenge, something profoundly anti-democratic, something totalitarian, something that resembles at least Italian fascism? This is what has been suggested by many Russian political...
Very much.
Very
much.
It's like Italian fascism in the case of Putin.
With one exception. Mussolini was aesthetically, in fact, he was trying to find some ideal in aesthetism. Whereas, the Kremlin now is moving in another direction. The rest is nearly the same,
And look, it took so much time for the West to consolidate, to mobilize, to consolidate the power. But then they were victorious. And we had a Churchill, we had a Roosevelt, And when we complain about total absence of leadership, real leadership in the world, probably this is the time when the West is still sleeping, trying to wake up, trying to consolidate and mobilize its power.
Leonidas, I've been thinking about that because, my friends are working at the Freedom House, my friends are working for democracy promotion, and when we look at the indexes of democracy and freedom, we can come to conclusion that we have, not even dysfunctionality of the liberal democracy. We have crisis of the EU, retrench in the United States, and shrinking democratic global resource. But it doesn't happen, in a unique way. At least the West went through at least two crises in the 30s and in the 70s. And apparently crisis for liberal democracy is also the only way to re-energize itself. Maybe there is no other medicine to go ahead. Maybe only through crisis. The Western democracy understands the need, the time, and the moment to refurbish itself. The problem is when, I remember, was it Carter who said about malaise, the Western malaise? So the problem is, and the question, when the West starts not only to consolidate, on what basis? Because there need to be something else. But when Americans will finally understand that the world cannot survive without some kind of global leadership. When the European Union understands that this is time to refurbish some principles, norms, and standards, and then apparently it will be a moment of revival. I don't know a single case in the Western history when such countries, illiberal states like Russia, like Iran, like China, will try to start transformation when the West is sick, in the situation of malaise. So external environment is becoming one of the most important factors. Without you folks, we cannot go ahead. Without you, Ukraine cannot be viable. Without you, I wonder whether we could start transformation. So for the first time, it seems to me, I'm very much afraid that I'm too courageous at this conclusion, but I hope you'll bear responsibility for this with me. For the first time, it seems to me, at least in Russian history, the West has much more leverage than ever before to influence developments within Ukraine, within Belarus, within the Russian Federation. Why? Because the Russian rentier class is part of the Western community. It has been personally integrated into Londongrads, and we have so many Londongrads everywhere. And for the first time, the Russian economy is sucking to the West and dependable on the West. So the Russian economy and the state cannot survive in the isolated and marginalized form. So the West is becoming a crucial factor.
What is interesting, Lilia, I just written a book with Tomas Venclova, who is a noted Lithuanian poet, translator.
Another book, my God.
Yeah. It just happened to me, so I'm incurable at this point. Tomas Venclova, who is a beloved friend of mine, who is a poet, translator, Yale University professor.
A great man.
A great person, a wonderful person with whom I wrote a book about the search of optimism in the time of pessimism. And we were trying, like in the Candide of Voltaire, we're trying to find some form of optimism. Although
but
we live in the
not
time
in every area of Candide.
No, of course not. But what was important, that when I and Thomas started discussing those things, we agreed on one absolutely pivotal point. Mainly, that if globalization is a fact of life, if Russia cannot survive otherwise than through globalized economy, being linked to the West in more than one way, then Russia and Putin cannot prevail at this point. If globalization is weak, it could be a litmus test case. Then Russia could be successful at some point. It's a litmus test case concerning whether or not we live in a globalized world, whether or not we live in one single world. That was his point. But I would argue that there is another point. The question would be whether or not Yuri Afanasyev was right, the late Yuri Afanasyev, Russian historian, who said that this is the matrix of Russian unchangeability. That Russia doesn't change itself, and whether or not it depends on the West is a secondary question. The point is that, but that was his very pessimistic scenario, that Russia doesn't change. What is your attitude at this point?
Could I be a kind of advocate of the devil? Because I'm not sure that I would agree with both options. I'm not sure that I would agree with the great Venclova when he says that if globalization prevents Putin and Putin's Russia are dead. Because it depends what kind of globalization we are talking about. Now we are living in the globalized world, in the world of huge interdependency and interconnectivity. But the problem is that the West allowed the Russian, Azeri, Kazakh, Chinese rentier and ruling class to get personally incorporated into the West and create powerful lobbyist machines in the globalized world and to use the West in their interests. It's Tony Blair who is working for Nazarbayev. It's Schroeder who is working for Gazprom and Putin, and so on. Former Finnish Prime Minister, former Italian Prime Minister, former French politicians. So it's the illiberal world that is using globalization that spreads. It continues to spread. So it depends on who is controlling globalization and what are the principles of globalization. Is it based on rationality, business, commercial interests of Daimler brands or Siemens, or it's based also on some balance between standards and commercial interests? Because, well, we are not idealists. We understand that there should be some pragmatism. Regarding Yuri Afanasyev, well, it's such a great loss for us because he was such a sincere, such a great person. And great people are leaving us earlier. And the idiots stay longer. But you know, regarding Afanasyev and regarding my friends who believe that Russia cannot change, Russia's civilization and paradigm is incorrigible, I would say maybe because I'm naive and hopeless idealist living still in Moscow. If I live in Vilnius, Estonia, in Tallinn, maybe I would have another vision of that. But I do believe that really matrix as a system and the state cannot be modernized, Russian matrix, cannot be modernized, cannot be transformed and reformed. This is unchangeable matrix. But at the same time, when we look at the society, look at millions of Russians, at least thousands of Russians in Silicon Valley, they can accept another cultural code, another mode of behavior. When we are thinking about 15% of Russians who are in favor of liberal standards, when we are thinking about all demoralized Russians, zombied by TV propaganda every day and every minute, but still they voted for Putin as the person who is in favor of reforms when he was elected, in favor of, opening to the West. And when 65% of the zombied people who support Putin and even war in Ukraine, at the same time they think, we have somehow to communicate with the West. We have to open to the West. This is mentality, cognitive dissonance. So I do believe that still, I do believe that the hope that at least part of the Russian population could be reformable. I still believe in it. I still believe it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll have millions of Russians invading Ukraine. Otherwise, we'll have, thousands of Russians trying to cross the border with Estonia and Lithuania, and they do not want it. They don't want the war, and the military's drag is fading because, well, yes, people support Putin, but they don't want the war with Ukraine. So there is some kind of hope, not in the genetic code of the nation, but hope that the people are becoming pragmatic, consumption subjects, and start to think about the another future. Maybe I'm idealistic.
Moral blindness. Well, I think that when you mentioned the title of our book, the book that I wrote conjointly with Bauman, what came to my mind was the idea that there is such a thing as the red line. The red line, which is absolutely indispensable in world politics. And my question would be, Lilia, where does it stay? Where can we find the red line? Because was any red line in 2008 during the Russian-Georgian war? Was there any red line during the Ukrainian-Russian war? And I'm asking this because I met many people in the West, meaning, in the United States or Western Europe, who are very kind, very intelligent. But when it comes to politics, I, as a Lithuanian, feel that they are incurably naive because they blame Ukraine for the Ukrainian-Russian war. They blame, the plane which was downed, and not those who downed the plane. So meaning that when it comes to this, I think that I start thinking about Andrei Penkovsky, our friend, who phrased it in the following way: don't do it to me, do it to Julia. It's George Orwell, it's 1984. That's Winston Smith, before the cage with the rat, which is starving, and which is going just to jump into his face. And then he starts yelling, don't do it to me, do it to Julia. Do it to Syria. Do it to Ukraine. Don't do it to me.
Right.
Don't do it to Germany. Don't do it to France. Don't do it to Lithuania. Do it to Ukraine. Do it to Syria. Find a no man's place where no one would be really sympathetic or really, somehow deeply affected by what's happening. This is moral blindness. We are searching for no man's land, for no man's zone, where policymakers like Putin could improvise. I think this is a problem. This is a great problem, but probably there is hope that what's happening could be just get us back to our senses and back to reality.
I agree. I agree with your major line, and I agree with your very sad and dramatic message. This is the way I feel it. This is the way I accept this reality. This is the way I view it. And I remember when President Obama said, this is the red line in Syria. And then he decided that the red line could be, drawn somewhere else. Well, and there is a powerful Western community of experts, politicians, business, and maybe a population too, God knows, that they would like to have red line as something very ambivalent, ambiguous, yes, and every time rearranged, okay? But at the same time, it seems to me that accepting the sanction regime against Russia, the West, at least some powerful people in the West, including Angela Merkel and even Obama, they've started to understand that there should be maybe imitation of the red line, but they have to say no way, okay? So at the moment, the West is looking for some kind of a red line, but thinking that it could be reached on the basis of the package and trade-off, Minsk agreement, Syria agreement. This is an attempt of the West to find a red line and combine it with a compromise. Mm-hmm. In the end, we have Minsk agreement that cannot be realized, never. In the end, we have Syria agreement on ceasefire that cannot stand, and Aleppo is being bombed, because the current political leadership in the West, the leadership of stability, of the status quo, they would like to, again, to install, maybe not status quo ante, but some kind of status quo with no one's land in between, or as Kissinger said, who just visited Moscow, the lobbyist of the West and of the Kremlin in one person. Ukraine has to be a bridge in between. So some countries have to play the role of the bridge. A nation that has to play the role of the bridge. So apparently the West still have to find a consensus about red lines, which means about normative standards, and refurbish their strategic outlook. And it seems to me that in the way, we have to thank, it's a very maybe wrong word, to thank Mr. Putin for waking up the West, for forcing the West to start moving, stop dozing, look around. It's Putin's responsibility to reanimate NATO. NATO was in a rotten shape 2 years ago. Now NATO starts to think about life, a new life, and so the West has started this very complicated path. And I remember in your dialogue with Zygmunt Bauman, he or you used the way climbing the mountain, steep mountain, yes?
Yes, Bauman.
It was Bauman.
Yes, it was Bauman.
So the West has started to look for this mountain step. Well, it's true, nobody knows what the West will find on the top, but at least the process has started.
Lilia, would you believe in globalization with the human face? Just to paraphrase, what Alexander Dubček was thinking about socialism with the human face. Is globalization with the human face possible in the sense that it wouldn't be the Chinese scenario, the free market economy minus human rights, minus political liberty? It wouldn't be the Russian scenario, which would be, the oligarchic class and the class of very rich people accompanied by, lack of political liberty and respect for human rights. But would you believe in some kind of global consensus concerning human rights, sensitivities? Is it possible, or is it something that stands just like the dividing line between the two worlds?
Well, if I say that I don't believe it, then really it will be the end of civilization. Let's not follow Frank's suit, It's too early to say about the end of history. And so we have to believe that it's possible. But at the same time, we have to understand that the global consensus about the standards has to be enforced on those actors, countries, and political forces that would like to break the China.
Would you believe that, in a way, the Baltic states and Central Eastern European countries were successful after 1990? So we're trying to assess our way. And there are many ways to celebrate what happened to Lithuania. Accession to the EU, although the EU is quite shaky now, but still, that's the EU. Accession to NATO, becoming a NATO country. I think it's a success story, and many Ukrainians or Azeris would be very happy to emulate the Lithuanian path. But would you agree that the Baltic states are not a failure? It's a success story in some way.
Of course, you all are a success story, because if you failed to jump the boat, you would be in no man's land, just like Ukraine at the moment. Quite a disastrous scenario.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking about. I think that that's the dividing line.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Lilia, you wrote about Russia as a major challenge to the world in the 21st century. Wouldn't you agree that Russia is an existential threat, or is it exaggeration? Because even in the American military, there are people like Mr. Danforth or Breedlove, so I think very, very high-ranking top military officers who describe Russia as an existential threat to the West. In your analysis, you describe Russia as a possibility that the country could be viewed as a challenge to the world order and to the West?
Well, I still argue that Russia is a challenge, first of all, for Russia itself, for us. We are the challenge for ourselves. Because while we have to decide whether to return back to the 16th and 19th century, or whether to move on to a real 21st century. And Russia definitely, Russia as a half-frozen empire that failed to disintegrate. Russia as a superpower, yes, member in the Council, in the Security Council. Russia as a nuclear state, and Russia at the same time, absolutely unique civilization as a petrostate. There was never, ever, ever in the world's history nuclear superpower and the petrostate as a one country. It's absolutely unique civilization that is impossible to exist for a longer time. And at the same time, the country where the system cannot reproduce itself without expansion and without looking for the enemy. So this fact itself, the major principle of existence, expansion, looking for the enemy, and today forcing the West, areas of influence are not that important. The most important is, and maybe you have written a book about that, the most important is that the Russian matrix demands from the West to agree that Russia and other illiberal states will have the right to interpret the rules, the principles, and the world standards, which means this is the recipe for world disorder. And anyone could answer the question whether this Russian system is a challenge or a threat or not. Yes, existentially, it's absolutely unique situation, and existentially, it's the threat for itself and for the world order and for the neighbors, yes.
Lilia, I cannot forget one movie which is quite symbolic at this point, Andrei Tarkovsky's Nostalgia.
Yes.
So the movie which he made in Italy, and the irreplaceable, unforgettable Oleg Yankovsky is playing the role of a Russian artist who lives in Italy. And that is a very moving film about the Russian artist who loves Italy very dearly, but at the same time, he would be very happy to reconcile in his soul Russia and Italy, Russia and Europe. And he dreams about wonderful, magnificent Renaissance architecture or Piero della Francesca, and at the same time what he hears is a Russian folk song. Is it possible to reconcile this beautiful, eternal Russia and Europe? What do you say? That's the great question posed by Tarkovsky.
It depends on what you mean under eternal Russia, because I don't know what it is. Because what I believe that there are no traditional cultural characteristics or genetic code or Russian principles.
Birch trees, landscape, beautiful
There are nothing,
literature.
because Stalin already has liquidated everything, erased. But you're absolutely right. Culture and literature could easily be European integrated. But the rest, what else? Politics, principles, system, it's irreconcilable. Europe and you folks are our antithesis. But culture, of course, and it's very strange that Russian culture could be born and could prosper in such a very hostile for European standards environment. A paradox.
Lilia, would you agree with the famous formula, or the famous identity formula of the Russian intelligentsia? So I think it is something like that he or she was bound to choose between truth and fatherland or motherland. So would you agree that it still stands for the Russian intellectual like yourself, meaning that you are bound to choose between the truth and your country? Or is it better?
Well, firstly, I don't believe that Russian intelligentsia still does exist. It seems to me it perished. There is no intelligentsia with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was a very specific group, but intellectuals do exist. And I am not sure that there is a dissonance or conflict between truth, standards, and the state. I do believe that many already have started to choose truth and standards and believe that the new state could be formed on the basis of new standards. So I don't think that this conflict is omnipotent, but I do believe, and I see that there are too many people that cannot create a consensus in their soul about these things.
After the occupation and annexation of Crimea, what happened was that, very famous Russian film directors, artists, they wrote a famous letter where they, supported the project, so to say. It came as a great disappointment for many people because many people loved, great musicians and artists. All of a sudden, they became the signatories of that disgraceful letter, where they praised Mr. Putin up to the skies. And among them were, of course, Yuri Bashmet, the viola number one in the world. It was Gergiev, of course. At the same time, I have to say that it was deeply symbolic that a person who was a film director who made his film versions after Mikhail Bulgakov, Vladimir Bortko, he signed that letter as well. The director who made The Master and Margarita and The Heart of a Dog, he signed the letter, although the actor who played the role of Voland, he didn't. He didn't, the great Basilashvili, Oleg Basilashvili. So on that we have the great difference, almost the abyss, between, on the one side, people like Bashmet, Gergiev, Bortko, Bezrukov, and on the other side, Oleg Basilashvili, Mikhail Zhvanetsky, and of course the great actors and the great film directors like the deceased, like the Eldar Riazanov and others. What happened? Is it fear? Is it a kind of, il conformista, as Bertolucci would have said? What happened?
Leonidas, it seems to me it's simply confirmation of the fact that I've mentioned before, that intelligentsia does not exist as a social group, and even under the Soviet Union, intelligentsia, or what we kind of, mesmerized to some degree, was a very specific group of people that was allowed to have a soul, and at the same time, this intelligentsia, played the role of decoration for any system and the regime. Majority of them existed because they were servants of the court. And with 1981, the group perished. It has collected a collective suicide. And what we have now is the evidence, firstly, of existence of such emotion as courage and cowardice, an existence of such a dividing line as perfect and normal life, cars, consumption, etc., and lack of it, an existence of such a principle as total demoralization in the time of rot and lack of any trajectory. In the period when we don't see the difference between dusk and dawn, and we don't know what we have at the moment, because we have something and some glimpse of light, but still we are not sure whether it's dusk or dawn. And for pragmatic people, and you're talking about pragmatic and successful people, it's much easier to be close to the court. But they resemble fleas very much, because the moment of danger, they will jump the boat. They will look for another host. And the problem, the difference between us and you folks in 1989, 1990, 1991, is that you and Poles and Czech, you had your own intellectuals with courage. And what you did, as far as I understand from what we discussed, you've achieved consensus between different elements of your political and intellectual elite that were ready to fight for national identity, for the new state on the basis of European trajectory. And we don't have possibility for this consensus. And we lost intellectual class that could, or maybe it would, God knows, that could reach, consensus on the basis of readiness to sacrifice. Sacrifice is such a great word.
Absolutely,
Sacrifice.
Absolutely, very much so. Lilia, before I give the floor to the audience for a question, for a comment, I would love to ask one more question, and that is the question about a very strange character. And the character happens to be quite talented, Nikita Mikhalkov.
Oh.
Nikita Mikhalkov, I think that he's trying to achieve in culture what Putin is trying to achieve in politics, to reconcile the ancien regime and communism, or, if you will, he is trying to reconcile what is impossible to reconcile. But in many ways, what results is a very strange mishmash of, the imperial grandeur, then, in a way, celebration of Stalinism, celebration, of absolutely horrible things that were absolutely suicidal for Russia herself. And at the same time, they try to come up with a message that every single episode, every single moment in our history was a glorious one.
The whole Mikhalkov dynasty, it's very strange because, their destiny, the family, father, brothers, persuades me that apparently, genetic code does exist. Well, I don't want to believe in this theory, but, there's so many examples of that. The whole family with a tradition of serving the Tsar and the court. Very talented. But their talent is buried by themselves because the more they serve, the more they lick the boots of the Tsar. Brezhnev, before Brezhnev, now Putin. Before that, it was Yeltsin. Okay? Mm-hmm. The more they lick their boots, the less they're persuasive, convincing, and they're losing and bury their talent. They're becoming laughing stocks. Mm. And it appears that even the Tsar and the Kremlin and the court, they're being fed by these fleas. They need a new meat, because they understand that they cannot legitimize them. Mm. They need some fresh blood and they need some kind of intellectual resistance at least. Mm-hmm. So, it's drama, but I don't care about their drama. And I stopped watching his movies.
But does Putin himself believe in the possibility to reconcile the Soviet Union and Russia?
It's very difficult to be a shrink of a person who was taught to conceal all his ideas, thoughts, and to imitate. Putin is a personality. Apparently, when he is gone from the Kremlin, we'll have a lot of data, information, material about it, at least his actions, not thoughts. But apparently, he represents a very interesting example of the new cohort of people. We never had such a group of people in power. In fact, as you know, our history, we never had Praetorian regime. Mm. For the first time, we have Praetorian regimes. We have dogs, the people who have to serve as dogs at the gate of the Kremlin, we have in power. And for the first time, they symbolize the link between power, property, and repressive regimes. It's a new type of people. We never had them. And hardly they have any imagination, any thoughts, any strategic outlook, with the exception of one, and we know what it is, to survive at any cost. Mm. Yes, technology is great, but their technology of survival is great only because the rest is weak. The rest is weak. And what we have now, some of my colleagues are saying, just look at him, look at them, how bravely, courageously, successfully he is doing everything. Just look. Ukraine, we stopped Ukraine in NATO. Just look in Syria, we forced Obama to sit down and just, return to the business as usual. But they don't understand that some tactical victories are possible only because the rest is weak, and because these tactical victories are the signs, the symbol of strategic disaster and strategic failure. They failed. They brought Russia to a dead end and make it isolated, marginalized country, mistrusted by the world.
Well, I think it's time for me to thank Lilia. Words cannot describe, how grateful I am, for this.
How grateful I am. Thank you.
For this conversation. And Lilia, thank you very much indeed. I have to say that, it's a great, great feast. It's a great event when it's possible to share such insights as yours with young people at my university. And for your coming and for your wonderful words of wisdom and expertise, I thank you.
Exaggeration, but I love it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor
Thank you very
Donskis.
much.
Thank you, folks.